Depending on definitions and semantics, it can be reasonably argued that Dark Magician represents one of the two oldest deck archetypes in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, along with Blue Eyes. Long fan favorites due to the anime, both Blue Eyes and Dark Magician languished behind numerous decks for years until both recently got shots in the arm. While Blue Eyes has certainly seen more success than Dark Magician in recent competitive play, it can be argued that finally, with the release of Eternal Soul, it is now time to see what quote-unquote full power Dark Magician decks can accomplish. So, what does my Dark Magician deck look like? Obviously, the first step in any Dark Magician deck is to add the feature player himself, 3 copies of Dark Magician. While he may be the so-called Ultimate Magician, overall, Dark Magician is rather below average as a level 7 2500 no-effect monster. However, fortunately for Dark Magician, and perhaps why he is the Ultimate Magician, there are a number of tricks up his sleeve to mask those inherent weaknesses. Almost immediately going against the popular grain, I only run 1 copy of Magician of Dark Illusion. The biggest problem with Magician of Dark Illusion is that it only takes the name of Dark Magician when on the field, not in the hand or graveyard, heavily limiting its overall usefulness. The original Dark Magician is superior in both the hand and the graveyard due to its ability to work with all of the major support cards in this deck. The summons from the hand effect is only marginally useful because it occurs during the opponent's turn, limiting combination plays by giving the opponent the ability to remove it from the field before you can actually do anything with it. Sure, one could activate a spell or trap during the opponent's end phase, but that will typically leave you down both a monster during the opponent's turn and make your defensive capacity less efficient relative to what your opponent can do. Realistically, this card really only provides a consistent benefit when Dark Magical Circle is on the field, and once it hits the graveyard, it's basically dead. With these name-related disadvantages, I find running 1 is more appropriate in my mind because multiple copies hurt due to the once-per-turn condition on its effect. In short, in my opinion, Illusion is just too slow, too unreliable, and too dependent on Circle in this deck. However, you could definitely field a design that's more suitable for running multiple copies, and some people have. I don't run any copies of Dark Magician of Chaos. Despite the errata, the card can still be quality, but it just takes too much time to get it onto the field, even with dedication, and running those dedications further promotes brick hands. One of the problems with DMOC, even when it hits the field, is that 2800 attack, while high, tends not to be enough in the environments plagued by 3000 attack and 2800 defense ABCs, 2800 and 3000 attack Cosmos ship, 2800 defense Beatrices, and 3000 attack Blue Eyes. In short, in my opinion, DMOC just produces more negatives than positives over the long haul. Magician's Rod is basically mandatory at 3 copies. When normal summoned, you receive a critical search that is not only a free +1, but will also frequently be an important catalyst to creating further advantage. The secondary graveyard effect is also rather nice. Tribute a spellcaster during the opponent's turn when a spell and trap is activated, and add Rod from the graveyard to your hand, which creates the possibility for another +1, and also operates as a nice safety net because the opponent will definitely be gunning for that Dark Magical Circle. So it's always nice to have that Rod sitting in your hand that you can just normal summon during the next turn and put another circle onto the field. This combination is especially rather effective with Eternal Soul on the field because it can summon Dark Magician from the hand or graveyard for free, creating a nice advantage engine between tributing Dark Magicians and putting Rods back into your hand. If Rod were a level 4, it would basically have been perfect in a realistic sense, but alas, it's not. In contrast to Magician's Rod, I run no copies of Magician's Robe. The problem I find with Robe is that it is not difficult to get Dark Magician on the field via numerous other means that do not involve discarding a spell or trap card during the opponent's turn. In addition to these multitude of other means to put Dark Magician on the field, you tend not to get much advantage out of the discard even if you choose to run Robe. There's not a lot of cards that work well with this deck that don't mind being in the graveyard either, so typically it is a sunk cost. Once again, as mentioned with Illusion, summoning Dark Magician during the opponent's turn is also rather uneventful without Circle on the field. One could argue, Well, you're supposed to have Circle on the field. That's a critical element of this deck. Definitely a true point. But take a wild guess what card is top priority for removal by the opponent. Without Circle, Robe, far too negative, and even with Circle, it's really not very positive. The revival effect would have been much better if Robe was level 3 or 4, for then it could have been an XZ piece during your next turn. But as a level 2, there's very little synergy with the rest of the deck, so all it really does is act as either a slightly above average wall or a tribute target, neither of which appeals enough to me. I also pass on skilled Dark Magician because there are more effective ways of getting Dark Magician onto the field with the new support. Palladium Oracle Mahad is one of those toss-up cards. There is no strong argument for running it or against running it. Its Dark Magician floating is nice, as well as its increased attack against dark monsters. While one could argue that there is the ever-present shadow or annoyance of drawing it during the opening hand, thereby making it a dead card, this issue is of little probabilistic consequence when only running one. However, Mahad also struggles to actually apply meaningful pressure to the opponent due to its summons inconsistency and light attribute standing, for if you do draw it in the opening hand, it basically sits there unless you run a Sword of the Seven Stars. Overall, there are a fair amount of wildcard choices for this deck in my opinion, and Mahad is certainly one of them. However, I feel with the way this build is constructed, there are better choices, so I do not run any copies of Mahad. In my eyes, there are two quality ways to run this deck: a Spellcaster Turbo type build, or a Magician Dark Rank 4 hybrid. I prefer the latter method, whereas it seems a lot of other people favor the former method. With this strategy in mind, though, I like running 3 copies of Kozmoll Wickedwitch for field control purposes, especially limiting the idea of the opponent just removing Eternal Soul from the field and then going direct attacking ham on your life points. And 3 copies of Juragedo to help get over larger attack point monsters when Dark Magic Circle is not available, as well as help finish off OTKs and set up main phase 2 XZ plays like number 66 or Castel. Finally, rounding out the monsters, I like running 1 copy of Kycoo the Ghost Destroyer and 1 copy of Glow Up Bulb. Ghost Destroyer is a great target for navigation, as well as effective graveyard banish control, and Glow Up Bulb can be incredibly nasty thanks to the ability of Eternal Soul. Summon a Dark Magician via Soul, normal summon Glow Up Bulb, make a Scarlight, special summon Glow Up Bulb from the graveyard, and make a Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss. If you have a pre-existing Dark Magician, this combination can extend to make an Abyss, and any generic level 8 synchro you want if Abyss deals damage during the battle phase to special summon Glow Up Bulb from the graveyard. While I don't main deck them, I do side deck 2 copies of Night Drago Lich because this deck really only does extra deck plays when it either tries to lock down the opponent or when it's just about to OTK the opponent. And summoning from navigation when this is on the field is really not advisable, so Night typically does not negatively affect the efficiency of this deck when playing it smart. And for this deck, getting over negators like Tree Toad can be an annoyance that's almost automatically dealt with by Night. For the direct spell and trap-based Dark Magician support, I like running 3 copies of Dark Magical Circle. Not surprisingly, for anyone who knows anything about the new Dark Magician deck, Circle is a great card, for it is a potential +1 with knowledge of your deck for the next few turns at worst, when it resolves successfully. Its banish effect is incredibly important for this deck as a means to effectively interrupt opponent plays, especially in combination with Eternal Soul. I run only 1 copy of Illusion Magic, for running multiple copies, in my opinion, can get very inefficient. Overall, there are more balanced ways to start combos in the deck than have to deal with that inefficiency as well as have to tribute a spellcaster. Realistically, I only run 1 copy of Illusion Magic because it is searchable by Rod, which makes it a very efficient way of starting your combination. After you activate 1 Illusion Magic, the second and third copies, if you choose to run them, heavily drop in overall efficiency. Realistically, it could be argued that the number of copies of Illusion Magic you run is probably number of copies of Navigation you run -1. That might be a good rule of thumb, so based on that rule of thumb, one can automatically assume right now how many copies of Navigation I run. In addition, to further aid Dark Magician searching, I run 1 copy of Summoner's Arc, because it allows you to add a Dark Magician without having to go through the bother of tributing a spellcaster. I run 1 copy of Dark Magic Attack as the archetype-specific Harpy's Feather Duster that can easily be searched via Eternal Soul, and its Dark Magician on the field condition is rather easy to achieve. I think multiple copies produces too much bricking probability, because in the end, Attack is a support card, not a card that really starts combinations. Thousand Knives is a possibility, but I'm not really a fan of it, so I skip it. Rounding out the general dark magic support that I run 1 copy of Eye of Timaeus to bring out Dark Paladin, which can be very effective against Blue Eyes or any other dragon matchup, or just be generally annoying to any deck due to its spell negation effect. For those who are not interested in running Eye of Timaeus, an interesting monster tech is Shadow Priestess of Ohm. Shadow Priestess of Ohm can be used for combination plays off of Navigation to increase OTK probability. Activate Navigation during your turn or your opponent's end phase, bring out Dark Magician and Ohm, then make some more plays, and then use Ohm to tribute off 2 or 3 more monsters in main phase 2 due to no once per turn condition to deal an additional 1600 to 2400 damage and probably end the duel if you haven't already. As a level 4 1700 attack dark monster, Ohm also works well with some of the other strategies in this deck without producing inefficiencies. Dark Magic Expanded is not a bad card, but in my opinion it just does not do enough to warrant a spot in my deck. For the most part, at its heart, Expanded is a defensive-based card, but only works once. If it had some form of self-recovery from the graveyard, like you can skip your next draw phase to add this card from the graveyard to your hand, then it would have been much more interesting. How I run Dark Magicians is more of kind of an attrition-based deck, and Expanded does not really help. In large part, I would prefer a card like Ultimate Providence over Expanded if I wanted protection beyond banishing Navigation from the graveyard. Dark Magic Inheritance is a solid card, but in my experience, outside of the first couple turns, it really starts to get in its own way due to lack of options. Realistically, while Inheritance can grab a Circle, Soul, or Navigation from the deck, in addition to other cards, acquisition of these cards is not difficult in this deck. However, one strategy is to drop the number of copies of Circle and Eternal Soul to 2, then run 2 Inheritance in effort to eliminate some multi-copy inefficiency. Overall, though, while I don't run any copies, I certainly cannot say anything significantly negative against that above strategy. It's just not my cup of tea. If Dark Magic Veil was a quick play spell, it would definitely be worth consideration due to potential combination with Dark Magic Circle during the opponent's turn. However, without that quick play standing, it just pales in comparison for me relative to a card like Eternal Soul. This card is definitely worth running if you run Dark Magician of Chaos, but without it, there really isn't a meaningful target that makes this card worth the lack of general impact it's going to have. For the rest of the spells, I run 1 copy of Raigeki, but I do not run Soul Charge because I feel this deck relies more on its battle phase to make plays than a lot of other decks, and Eternal Soul also does a nice job of covering the role of Soul Charge. Draw power is very important in this deck for getting your combo pieces, so I run 1 copy of Upstart Goblin, 3 copies of Allure of Darkness, and 3 copies of Pot of Duality, because a significant amount of special summoning will occur during your opponent's turn thanks to the properties of Eternal Soul and Navigation. Note that once you get your first Rod, I don't feel you should have to worry so much about banishing a second or a third for the lure, because you can frequently just recycle that first Rod back into your hand via its second effect. Finally, I run 1 copy of Instant Fusion for Norden summoning to expand Synchro and XZ play potential. While I don't run it, 1 copy of Foolish Burial is also a valid choice to help feed the effects of Eternal Soul and Glow Bulb. For the traps, I run 3 copies of Eternal Soul. Similar to Dark Magic Circle, it is one of the key combo cards for this deck. Thus, while running 3 copies can produce some inefficiencies, it is a detriment I am willing to accept for the higher rate of combo potential. Eternal Soul is the chief summoning engine for Dark Magician, bringing it out of the hand or the graveyard, and in combination with Dark Magic Circle can be utterly devastating for the opponent. The Destroy All Monsters on your field effect is not backbreaking for this deck, because Wicked Witch's destruction negation effect can help maintain field presence, and Juragedo can be used to establish some temporary field presence as well. Pairing Eternal Soul with Master Key Beetle can also be a valid strategy. I only run 2 copies of Navigation, for one of the trickier elements of this deck is having Dark Magicians in the hand to actually activate the second and, if run, third copy of Navigation, for after the first activation, Dark Magicians in the hand become significantly less probable. To this point, I think a third copy is overkill and leads to inefficiency. Also at this time, Navigation is one of those cards that still has significant room for increased potential, for the current Dark Spellcaster pool to draw from for that additional summons from the deck is rather light in its overall usefulness. The Spell Trap Negation Graveyard effect is also nice, especially for protecting Eternal Soul. Due to the fact that Glow Up exists, producing synchro capacity, one can summon PSY-Framelord Omega and continuously return Navigation from the Banish Zone to the graveyard to receive additional negation effects if a Dark Magician is on the field, something that's not too difficult to accomplish. Finally, closing out the traps, I run 1 copy of Solemn Warning, 2 copies of Solemn Strike, and 1 copy of Vanity's Emptiness. Another interesting side deck card, though, is Dark Renewal, for its special summoning and monster removal effect. However, main decking this card can be a little suspect in this particular deck because of Pendulum decks basically shrugging it off and bricking potential. For the extra deck, I run 1 Dark Paladin, 1 Elder Entity Norden, 1 Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss, 1 Trishula Dragon of the Ice Barrier, 1 Scarlight Red Dragon Archfiend, 1 PSY-Framelord Omega, 1 Hi-Speedroid Chanbara, 1 Red Eyes Flare Metal Dragon, 1 number 11 Big Eye, 1 Ebon Illusion Magician, the standard number S39 Utopia the Lightning and its partner, number 39 Utopia, 1 number 66 Master Key Beetle, 1 Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer, and 1 Abyss Dweller. In the end, Dark Magicians can definitely compete in the meta with its new support. In my opinion, the most important element to success for this deck is to minimize the probability of inconsistency. Based on the effects and quantity of cards that make up the deck and optimize the design in a sense, Dark Magicians are similar to full power Monarchs in the sense that there is an inherently higher probability of bricking for this deck than other decks, no matter how well designed the deck, so managing that inconsistency is important. Of course, this point creates an interesting issue, for I do not think that the so-called standard build, i.e. the build 90% of people seem to run, does a good job at mitigating this chief inherent weakness. Therefore, some of the recent success the standard build has produced has been rather surprising to me, for when I play the standard build, I experience a lot of inconsistency. Maybe I'm just unlucky, I don't know. Overall, most designs, including this deck, are rather effective at OTKing, but with the addition of Juragedo, I find this deck to be better at achieving that OTK feat, in addition to being more consistent. Also, the addition of Glow Up Bulb provides some interesting synchro versatility, more so than Knights and Sorcerer. Well, that is my Dark Magician deck. Thank you for your attention, and your time. I'm out.